You are now listening to The Unwavering, the movement dedicated to educating and empowering the brave men and women who have or are still serving our great nation. What's up, everyone? This is Kevin with another episode of The Unwavering. Before we begin, as always, I just want to say a huge shout out to our military community, the active duty service members, the reservists, the veterans, as well as the families that continue to support them. Today we have an extremely special episode, one that talks about PTSD and kind of combating that and learning to find yourself in the process. So I'm super excited for today's episode. I know that there's a lot of people just wanting to be heard and wanting to find their way. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic over to my friend John and let him introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. John McCaskill. I am wrapping up a 23-year Navy career in August. I've still got a few months left, but for all intents and purposes, or at least for most intents and purposes, I'm done with the Navy. I've got an internship that I'm doing with a nonprofit called Veterans Path. In Veterans Path, we try to get veterans back to a sense of peace, acceptance, transformation, and honor. And that's where the word path in our name comes from: peace, acceptance, transformation, and honor. And we do that by introducing them to the life-changing and life-saving practices of meditation and mindfulness. And I'm sure we'll get into it here in the show, but I found that later in my career, I wish that I had been introduced to it earlier, because I truly do believe in it now. I did have my own stereotype against it, or not so much against it, but a stereotype of who practiced it, and that stereotype didn't fit me. I truly do now, because I basically showed the science and the benefits behind it. I did, in fact, start practicing it, and now here I am, not only practicing, but trying to teach it to others, because I do fully believe in the effects and the benefits thereof. I'm married with 2 little ones and going to be wrapping up my career here in August. So that's a little bit about me.
That's incredible. Getting to hear the types of perceptions that you had about reaching out, asking for help, and finding balance is, I think, crucial, and I think it speaks to a lot of people. So before we continue with the questions, for those guys who are just tuning in, would you mind telling us a little bit more about where you come from, branch, rank, and length of service?
Sure, yeah. So in the Navy, Navy commander, I've been in the SEAL teams since 2003. I started as an enlisted guy in 1996, ended up going through the Naval Academy, went from the Naval Academy out to SEAL training through BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL training in Coronado, California, and then went out to the SEAL teams, primarily serving out here on the East Coast. I did do one stint on the West Coast at a special boat team, and then I did do a stint at the Naval Postgraduate School, where I got my master's degree in operations research. But the rest of the time, basically been out here on the East Coast and down in Tampa with Special Operations Command.
Awesome. That's incredible. I'm sure you got to make some very good connections, some really good friends and family. So
I did, sure did, man. I've enjoyed my time.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. You know, when we speak about Veterans Path, when I was on LinkedIn, I kept seeing consistent posts about the things that you guys are doing, how you're giving back to the community. Can you kind of elaborate on Veterans Path? What does that mean, and why is the mission so important to you?
Sure. So first off, I didn't really have a negative perception of those who were seeking out mental health, but it was more when people talked about meditation and mindfulness that, in my mind, the image that I had of that was either kind of a hippie or a monk. And I don't have anything against either one of those, but it's just not the profile that I fit. I'm clean cut, clean shaven military guy, right? And try to keep myself in a fairly professional manner. So that's kind of how I perceived myself. And I didn't perceive that profile fitting the profile of somebody who practiced mindfulness and meditation. Now, that all said, if people were seeking out other forms of mental health support, I fully supported it. You know, if they needed to talk to their psych or their psychologist, if they were getting some type of mental health medication, as the military quite often does, then I supported it. Now, when I was doing my own mental health support, I was also on various medications. And I believe that there's a time and place for those, but I personally did not like how I was on those. I felt that I was kind of a different person, that I was acting differently, that I was basically numb to a lot of emotions that I would have felt otherwise, which I guess is kind of the point at times. It's supposed to make you less anxious, less depressed, but I enjoy feeling life. So even if it is a little bit of anxiety, I enjoy being able to actually know that I'm living a life. So I tried to come off those medications, and one of the docs was like, well, if you're going to come off the medication, then you need to do something because you have some stress and anxiety that you're dealing with, and we want to help you with that. So he introduced me to mindfulness and meditation, and at first I kind of laughed at him and was like, hey, I don't believe in meditation, or I think that the stereotype or the profile of a practitioner doesn't fit who I am. I didn't even know what mindfulness was at the time. He sat me down and explained, hey, here's the science, physiology behind practicing meditation and what happens to your brain. And then he told me some very high performing individuals who also didn't fit the profile or the stereotype of practitioners. And so I was like, well, if they're practicing and here's the science behind it, I'll give it a try. So I tried it out for a couple of weeks, didn't really feel that too much had changed in who I was and how I was handling things. And he kind of laughed at me and was like, well, that's like going to the gym for a couple of weeks and thinking that you're going to be this super bodybuilder.
Right.
So I went back, started practicing again about another 6 weeks after that. So a total of about 2 months of practicing. And then that's when I started to feel differences in how I was handling stress, how I was handling anxiety, and I wasn't seeing the extreme lows that I had seen from depression before. So this is all while I'm active duty, which I still am, but this is about 3 years ago or so now. And same time, I was starting to think about what I was going to do after the military and looking at different industries that are out there. So I was looking at commercial real estate and private equity and finance. And those were all great jobs, nothing against them, but they just weren't jumping out at me as something that I was passionate about. And so I was simultaneously doing that and starting to deepen my practice of meditation and mindfulness, learn more about it, becoming more passionate about it. And then people were asking me what I was doing differently, and I started telling them what I was doing. Initially, I was a little tentative to tell them that because I honestly felt a little embarrassed. And after I did tell them, the reception that I got was people asked me, well, okay, I want to know more about that. So lo and behold, the answer of what I wanted to do after I left the military was right there in front of me. It was, in fact, teaching mindfulness and meditation. So I thought, hell, well, I'm gonna start a nonprofit that does that. And in doing my research, I realized that Veterans Path already exists, and they do that already through networking and through different workshops that I did. Got introduced to some of the players in Veterans Path, and they asked me to come on board as their executive director, which at the time I was not able to do, but I could come in as their deputy executive director if they were able to find somebody else that could do the role of executive director, because that takes more time than I was able to give. And so I came on board with Veterans Path in November of last year, so November 2019, as their deputy executive director through a military internship called the SOCOM Care Coalition Fellowship, which is an extension of the DoD SkillBridge internship. And I've been working with them since November. And in that role of deputy executive director, I am responsible for helping to fundraise. I'm responsible for tying us in with other nonprofits where there's some type of strategic partnership potential. And then I've also got a podcast for Veterans Path where I interview people who practice mindfulness and meditation or are involved in the mental health industry in some capacity, trying to break down those stereotypes that I had and trying to break down the stigma of seeking mental health support. So that's a little bit about me and how I got involved with Veterans Path and what I do for Veterans Path. As far as what Veterans Path does as a whole, we introduce veterans to mindfulness and meditation, and that's typically in outdoor settings. The population that we've historically served are people who are stress injured or morally injured or struggling with some type of post-traumatic stress, military sexual trauma, some type of traumatic stress. Now, we are also currently going through a strategic pivot where we're going to try to offer those same services to transitioning service members, because military transition itself is a stressful time. Sure, it's not traumatic stress, but it is stressful and can weigh on the service members' minds, it can weigh on the family members' minds quite a lot. And so we feel that these life-changing practices, meditation and mindfulness, they should be introduced earlier to service members so that they can handle the transition better. And then as they handle transition better, their families are going to be better. Ultimately, when they leave the service, they are going to be more mentally prepared for what's out there. They're going to be more resilient for the stress and the anxiety that may come with being on the outside. So I think that was a really long-winded answer to your question there, but I think I answered everything.
You gave me everything I was looking for and then some. So I'm super grateful for that.
Good.
I'm glad that you mentioned a few key points that I would like to bring up.
Sure.
The first one that came to mind was when you said, as a leader, as a friend, as a mentor, you were all about others seeking help. But when you began to seek help, you were kind of weary about telling others because you were either embarrassed. In those situations, what do you think it is? Do you think it's our own personal ego? Do you think it's pressure from society or us not wanting to be treated differently or seen differently?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the mental health piece, I wasn't embarrassed about. As a matter of fact, when I was meeting with my psychologist and my psychiatrist, I used to put that in big red ink on a big calendar that sat right behind me at my desk where everybody could see it at work. Because I do feel that as a leader in the military, it's our responsibility to make it acceptable to go and seek out mental health and show that it is not only there for when you're having challenges, but it is there as a maintenance thing. Just like the gym is there to maintain good physical health, the psychologists and psychiatrists that are there for the military are there to help us maintain our mental health. Now, what I was embarrassed about, and it goes straight back to this, the stigma and the stereotype, was admitting that I was meditating because I felt a little embarrassed about that. I felt embarrassed about it because of those stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. And I felt that anybody that I told about my meditation, my practicing mindfulness, would start to think that I had kind of gone off the deep end or that I had started to become kind of woo-woo myself, which in hindsight, I've met... Since I've been a practitioner and now a teacher of mindfulness myself, I've met many people who practice and many who do not fit those profiles. And then I've met many who do fit the hippie and the monk profiles. And you know what? They're awesome people, and I have no problem with them whatsoever. So I think that helped to break down the feeling of embarrassment that I had. Was one, it was my ignorance, which I hope has been mitigated. And two, what I felt was other people's ignorance, which now as I'm telling people about this, as I'm sharing my story, I'm hoping that I am helping to break down their ignorance levels of the true fact of who practices these life-changing and life-saving practices.
Right, absolutely. And for myself, I am huge into history. I would like to consider myself somewhat a student of war.
Nice.
I like to study ancient battles. And if you look from various different cultures throughout history, look at samurais, you look at
Right.
Romans, so many different cultures
Yep.
actually in some form practice some state of meditation and mindfulness as you speak of. So
Right.
in my eyes, you being a student of war, you being a Navy SEAL, looking at it from an outside perspective, I don't see it as anything embarrassing. I can understand how maybe, from your perspective, you could see it like that. But
Yeah.
for everyone that's listening, it doesn't matter if you're an aircraft maintainer. It doesn't matter if you're a hippie, if you are the baddest Navy SEAL on the planet. Some of the greatest people throughout history have practiced mindfulness and meditation. So
Right.
it's not a negative. If anything, it may allow you to reach much higher and achieve things that you weren't originally capable of. So I'm glad that you mentioned that.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could just jump in real quick, Kevin. So, one, I am certainly not the baddest Navy SEAL out there, probably one of the more tame guys out there. But two, the next piece is that lends right back to my ignorance, right? So I will admit that I am not a big history buff. I'm math minded, and my history goes in one ear and goes out the other after I take a test. So I'm pretty poor in my knowledge of history. Now, that said, since I've been practicing meditation and mindfulness, been doing research specifically on who used to practice this, and you're spot on. I mean, the Spartans and the samurai were amazing warriors, and they did practice some form of meditation to prepare themselves for war or for training. So it only makes sense that we as modern day warriors do the same thing in preparing ourselves mentally for the battlefield. And this is just one of those ways to do that. So I just wanted to jump in and say, yes, it was absolutely my ignorance that made me feel embarrassed. And that was a piece of the ignorance there, and that I didn't know my history.
Personally, I don't think it's your ignorance. I think as a Western society, we haven't really adopted this to the same level as countries like India or Japan. So I don't necessarily think it's ignorance. I think it's maybe a combination of ignorance and maybe a combination of our societal norms. But speaking about that, speaking about you and I coming from Western society, I think there's still a lot of people who don't understand what meditation is.
Right.
When you speak about meditation and mindfulness in Veterans Path, does that mean that we have to sit completely still in a silent room? Like, is that what we're talking about?
It can be. It's not necessarily, it's not exclusively that. That's a piece of it if that's what you want to do, if that's how you want to practice. And some people have to practice that way to keep their mind focused on the actual sitting. That said, there are many other ways to meditate, but you have to be very intentional about your meditation. So there's kind of two circles if you envision a Venn diagram, and you've got meditation in one of those circles, and then you've got mindfulness in another one. And you can practice mindfulness without meditating, and you can practice meditation without being mindful. You can do a transcendental meditation, which is where you're focused on a mantra or other types of meditation. But you take those two circles and you kind of overlap them, and that's where mindfulness meditation is. And that's where you're being mindful as you meditate. So an example of a mindfulness drill that you could do just about anywhere. A lot of people listening may be, working behind a desk, and somebody shows up with an assignment to them, and they slap that assignment on the table. And the physiological response is to react with your amygdala, or your fight or flight mechanism in your brain. Well, you can kind of overcome that amygdala hijacking by taking just a few deep breaths and focusing on that breath, actually focusing on the sensation of the air moving into your nose and then moving out of your mouth. And if you double the amount of time that it takes to breathe in, you double that amount of time to breathe out. So if you breathe in for 2 seconds, if you breathe out for 4 seconds, you're physiologically tapping into the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system is actually able to bring your respiratory rate down, your blood pressure down, your heart rate down. So it kind of de-stresses you. So that's how we are working to be mindful in our days and actually de-stress throughout our days. But that's not meditation. Meditation is where you actually set aside time, maybe to go and do a walking meditation. So, a 15-minute meditation as you walk through the woods, and you're paying attention to every step. You're paying attention to the smell of the leaves in the pine straw. You're paying attention to the sounds that you hear. You're being mindful, but you actually set aside that time to do it. So it's a walking meditation. So in Veterans Path, what we teach is, yes, we do sitting meditations where we're very quiet, guided meditations sometimes on their own, where it's just being quiet in your head. But then we also do walking meditations, listening meditations, even sometimes just being where you are. You can stand and meditate. It doesn't have to be sitting in the lotus position as we all kind of imagine meditation to be. So there's definitely different forms of meditation, and we do teach mindfulness at Veterans Path as well, but they are certainly not exclusive to a quiet room where you sit in the lotus position.
I'm really grateful that you broke it down and gave us some of those examples, because out of my own curiosity, that was going to be my next question. Is it possible for someone whose mind is always active, or someone who, as embarrassing as this is to say, I'm terrified of silence? If a room is too quiet, I start to get anxiety, and it's not good for me. But I've found that me personally, if I'm in the ocean and I'm listening to the water, if I'm fishing, for me, that's like my place of Zen. That's the most tranquil place I can go to when I just need a moment to myself, where I need to recharge. So I guess that's my interpretation of practicing meditation and mindfulness in my own spirit. I know it's different for different people, but
right.
I'm glad that you are teaching listeners and the people that you're affecting with your organization that, hey, you don't have to sit in a still room. Perhaps you can take a walk and enjoy nature, take in the sights. You can listen to the birds chirping, or go on a hike and challenge yourself, challenge your mind, and still find that inner peace.
Right. Absolutely. And The piece that you touched on there just a second ago, you said that you have trouble meditating yourself because your mind is constantly active. Well, all our minds are constantly active. I mean, trying to shut your mind down is impossible. And that's the kind of the misperception that people have about meditating, is that you're going to shut your mind down and it's just going to be like when you shut down an automobile, where when you turn the key, the car is off. Well, you can't turn your mind off.
Right.
You can calm it and you can focus it. And that's what meditation is. So when you sit to meditate and you're 30 seconds in and your mind suddenly bounces off the wall and starts thinking about your to-do list or what you messed up yesterday or what you've got to do tomorrow, that is your monkey mind. That's what we call it, because it bounces around like a monkey does. But that's natural. That's what your mind is meant to do. And the very act of noticing that your mind has wandered off to that to-do list or that anxiety that you had about something you messed up yesterday or whatever, the very act of noticing that and then bringing it back to whatever it is you're focusing on, what I like to call an anchor. So if you're focusing on your breath, if you're focusing on the smell as you're walking through the forest, if you're focusing on the sounds of the birds chirping, if you're focusing on some anchor and then your mind wanders off, the very act of noticing that and then coming back to that anchor over and over and over, that is physiologically rewiring your brain to be more focused, and actually helps to shrink the amygdala, which I was referring to earlier, and that's your fight or flight response piece. If you're able to shrink that, then you're going to start responding with the part of your brain that you're supposed to respond with, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the cognitive thinking that we all have. And so that, again, that very act, sit down and meditate, 30 seconds in, you notice that your mind has wandered off. Noticing that, coming back to the anchor, whether it's your breath, sound, smell, whatever the case may be, come back to that. Doing that over and over and over rewires your brain to respond differently and to be more focused. And that time, let's say when you sit down to meditate the first time, is 15 seconds before you notice your brain bouncing around or your mind bouncing around. As you do it more and more, you're going to get to be able to focus for longer because you're developing those neural pathways, and that's going to become your standard response, is that you're focused. So, you may practice one day and for the whole week you try to meditate and you make it 15 or 20 seconds in before your mind starts racing. So the next week you make it a minute before your mind starts racing or wandering around. And then the next week, you're 3 minutes in. And then that's how you work your way up to meditation. It's just like the bench press. I mean, you don't get under, 300 pounds your first time on the bench press. Actually, I never get under 300 pounds, but
yeah, that makes two of us.
bottom line is, the bottom line is you never get under a very heavy weight right off the bat. You start light and you work your way up to lifting heavier weight. Well, the same thing with meditation is you start small, start with a 1 minute meditation, and the next day try to do a 2 minute meditation, or throughout the day try to do 3 or 4 1 minute meditations, and those actually have a cumulative effect, just as going to the gym would if you were running. If you run 100 yards, or later that afternoon you run 100 yards and you do that over and over, it has a cumulative effect and you're going to get in better shape. Well, your mind is going to get in better shape and you're going to be able to focus better. And so not only does that improve your meditation, but it improves your focus throughout the day, which ultimately improves your meditation. It's just this cycle where one improves the other. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of hit that point there where you mentioned your mind and struggling with meditation. As a matter of fact, just before this phone call with you, I was speaking with a good friend of mine who said she can't meditate. And I kind of went through the same spiel here. Everybody can meditate. It's just, one, not beating yourself up when you make it 15 seconds in and your mind wanders. And then 2, realizing that happens to everyone. That's like trying to control your heart and trying to stop it from beating. Can't do that. Can't stop your mind from wandering off either, but you can try to focus it. And the very act of noticing that it's wandered off and bringing it back to that focus point, that's gonna reset you.
It's so interesting to hear your take, and I'm really happy that not only are you giving us examples, but you're also tying the science into it, because I think that's really, like you said, for you, that was the selling point, was sure, you can offer me medication, you can offer me this, but what's the science behind it?
Absolutely.
How is it actually going to help me? And hearing you talk about the repetition,
right,
and building that cycle, building up your mind state, I think is ultimately what has probably had an effect on you and countless others. So it's a powerful thing for us to be able to speak about right now and share with others.
It has, absolutely.
You and I previously spoke, outside of this conversation, and one of the things that we discussed was the different types of treatment. Can we quickly talk about why, for you specific, because again, for some people it may work, for others it may not, but for you specifically, why was it that counseling and medication didn't have as powerful as an impact as meditation and mindfulness?
Well, two things. One, I think it did have an impact. Specifically the counseling that had tremendous impact, and I fully believe in continuing to get counseling as you're practicing meditation and mindfulness, because there are times when practicing these practices, you're going to tap into some memories that you may not have right there on the surface, but as you get a little bit deeper, some memories that you may not want to experience may bubble to the surface, and that very fact may require some talk counseling, speaking with a therapist, speaking with a psychologist, a psychiatrist. But I don't think it alone is enough. I think that there has to be the rewiring of your brain that comes with meditation and mindfulness that really helps to handle stress and anxiety and depression better. And that is not just the rewiring, but the shrinking of the amygdala, which I think is responsible for so much of what it is we interpret as stress. It's not necessarily the most stressful thing in the world to be handed that assignment that I was mentioning earlier, right? But because our brains are wired to react with that amygdala, then we go into stress overload when we shouldn't. It's because society has evolved faster than our bodies have. And the amygdala was responsible for fight or flight, to get away from a tiger or to get away from, the caveman next to you trying to take your food. Whereas nowadays, those same stressors are not out there as often. We still need the amygdala in order to react when stressors are in fact there,
Right.
but they're not as often, and it's certainly not as extreme most of the time. So, anyways, I do believe in counseling. I fully believe in it. And I believe that it's complementary to meditation and mindfulness. I still speak with counselors because I feel that they're just another tool in the tool bag to maintain your mental health. As far as medication, I think there are times when medication does help. It just personally did not help as much with me. It changed who I was, and I was on various medications. Some of them I put a lot of weight on. Some of them I was sleeping too much to where I wasn't able to do what I enjoyed doing. Some of them I was just numb to things that I used to enjoy. So I think that if you're experiencing extreme levels of anxiety or depression, then that may be the answer. It can also be complementary to mindfulness and meditation, I believe. But I think that slapping a drug on every time somebody says, hey, I'm stressed, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, is not the answer either. So there's some happy in between there. I do believe that counseling and medication work. It's just how and when you use them. And sometimes they're complementary to the practices that we're teaching. We are by no means saying that this is the end all be all and that everyone should stop all medication,
Right.
and that we should do away with psychologists and psychiatrists or family therapists. So I guess that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you gave your perspective. And like we both mentioned, it's not one size fits all when it comes to the human mind. Certain people are going to react differently to certain traumatic events in their lives, and that's okay. So
Right.
maybe, like you said, medication is the answer, and maybe counseling is, maybe it's mindfulness and meditation, maybe it's a combination of all of them.
Yeah.
I just, I get scared when I see friends who have been in helicopter crashes, who have been, in different situations. And from an outside perspective, they're not the same person. They're so doped up on medication that they kind of lose themselves.
Right.
Me looking at it, it does kind of worry me. And I wish that there was more I can do to help guide them. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to help and speak to you today, and maybe it's another tool in the toolbox that people can use.
Right.
Maybe it's something they use in combination to their counselors, to their medication. So thank you so much for giving us your perspective and kind of what you went through, because it's definitely helpful. Speaking of Veterans Path and the things that you guys are working on, for anyone that's listening and is thinking maybe now is the time for them to start practicing mindfulness and meditation, or at least getting more information, how do they get started and how can they connect with you or the organization?
Sure. So, how to get started? Yeah, very simply. I mean, if you're not able to come to one of our Veterans Path retreats, or even if you are able to come to one of our Veterans Path retreats, I recommend just starting very simply, downloading one of the meditation apps that are out there on your phone. And there's literally hundreds of them, but several of them that I recommend. One is eMindful. eMindful is an app and it has live video available. So it's nice because you're getting live instruction. Insight Timer is a very simple one, and I've actually got some stuff recorded on there that kind of goes through some of the same stuff that we've gone through on this episode of your podcast, just the science behind it and why it works. Let's see, Headspace, there's Waking Up, Calm. So those are just some very basic apps that are out there. Start small, just like I was saying before. Start with a couple of minutes here and there, and then build your way up. Don't try to jump underneath that 300-pound barbell. And then as far as getting a hold of me, I'm on LinkedIn. John McCaskill is JonMacaskill. As far as getting a hold of Veterans Path, we're online at veteranspath.org, or you can find us on most social media platforms that are out there. And then we also have the podcast, also named Veterans Path, that I host. And we bring on various group of guests from Veterans Path retreat alumni to Olympic gold medalists to corporate leaders, really just anybody who has a story to tell about mindfulness and meditation or mental health. So that's a little bit about how to start, how to get a hold of me, and how to get a hold of Veterans Path if you're considering starting your practice.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing those examples, John.
Absolutely.
For those of you guys who are listening, as John said, there are tons of free apps out there. There's tons of ways to get started. If you guys are struggling with anxiety, with PTSD, with any one of those tough situations, definitely don't be scared to reach out. Again, it doesn't matter if you're the greatest warrior on this earth, if you're just an average guy, if you're a hippie, just make sure you're asking for help. And once you find that help, once you find something that works, make sure that you pass that information along. That's what it's all about. I'm super honored to get the opportunity to speak to John today because I truly believe that our conversation will create waves. I think that some of you listening, this may be extremely beneficial for you, maybe a loved one, and it's just going to continue to go from there. So I'm definitely glad that we had this opportunity. Before we go, John, I'd like to open it up and leave it to you to give us either one piece of advice or, one thing that you think is just super important to tell everyone listening.
I mean, it's short and sweet, is that life is awesome and there's going to be times when it seems overwhelming, but it is never as bad as we anticipate or we perceive it to be. If we're able to just stop in the moment, take a deep breath in, focus on that breath, and then focus on that breath leaving our bodies. Sometimes even that 2-second, 3-second reset is all we need to gain a little perspective of what is going on around us. It sounds crazy, but those small little drills can really save your life or change your life for the better. So I highly recommend meditation. I highly recommend mindfulness, but sometimes it's just a quick breathing drill, which is in and of itself being mindful, that can change how your day is going.
Well, thank you for opening my eyes as to what's out there, kind of helping to shift that paradigm. I'm super excited to continue talking to you, to continue to get this type of mentorship and opportunity to help others. So thank you so much for coming on board today.
Thank you.
I'm excited. I'm sure the listeners will be just as excited, if not more. So thanks.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to The Unwavering. Please rate and comment on Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star and a great comment, and we may just read it on a future episode. Also, follow us on social platforms like Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Be sure to check back with us next week.